This is Industry Resumes for STEM roles. This is the first of a 4-part series that we're running this month on the major tools that you will need to apply to STEM roles. And the resume, at least for actively applying, is the first step. In case you missed it, I am Erin. I am going to be leading the presentation, and with me on the call today, monitoring the chat, and who's going to be helping with the Q&A is Jenny, also from Seismic. A little bit about the format for this presentation. For the first half hour, this will be a presentation going over an introduction to an industry resume, what it is, how it differs from an academic CV. And then we'll go through each section of the resume with tips for how you can tailor it to individual roles and stand out. After that 30 minutes, that will be the conclusion of the presentation, but we'll have an optional Q&A that will run to the top of the hour, where if you have specific questions, you can stay and ask those. We want to make sure that we have enough time to cover everyone's individual questions. And the first place I think to start is why are industry resumes so important, and why is it important to format them the way that we're going to say to format them? And that's because of the major fact that employers spend about 15 seconds screening your resume before deciding whether to dive deeper and learn a little bit more. For this initial screening process, everything that we're going to suggest is going to be about getting past that 15-second screen, where then you can go into a phone screen or an interview and really showcase and discuss in more depth the skills that you bring and your passion for the role. Now, our major tip for this is once you've implemented all of the tips that we've gone through to tailor your resume to a role, show it to a friend for 30 seconds, or if you're doing informational interviews, if you have some contacts in the STEM industry already, it's also helpful to show it to them to get their feedback as an industry professional. But regardless of who you show it to, ask them what stood out to them. Ask them, for example, to pick out what's the top 3 things that you noticed about me and my skills and my experience from scanning my resume. And then compare what they've told you to the job that you are applying to the job description that you have and that you're tailoring your resume for. And see if what they're mentioning aligns with what is mentioned in the job description. And if it's not, then you know that there's a little more revision that is necessary. And an industry resume, one of the major differences from an academic CV is length. Industry resumes for PhDs and postdocs or people with industry experience, about 2 pages. Bachelor's, master's, about 1 page is sufficient. And even though this can seem like really a limiting thing to be able to put everything you've done in just 2 pages, it's actually pretty helpful for helping you remove or minimize the non-relevant information and skills. If you already have a much longer resume, or if you already have an academic CV, it really helps you think about what do you want to prioritize including and what can you leave off. Now, this is for the 2 pages is for the final resume that you are submitting. Something that I like to recommend, because as you tailor for each role, you're going to put some skills on, you're going to take some skills off, expand on some experience, minimize some experience. You can have a template resume. And what I mean by template is not necessarily one you're building off of, but one that has a more complete description of your experience and skills that could be over 2 pages onto 3 pages, but that you remove some of the non-relevant things for the specific roles that you apply to. So you have a general resume, and then you change that one slightly to be the individual resumes that you apply with at 2 pages. Another big general aspect for resumes is less is actually more. If you look up template resumes online, a lot of them will have very fancy designs, columns and places for pictures and places to list different skills and different bars that will show how experienced you are with each one. But a really fancy resume design in STEM can actually make it harder to read your resume, because someone who's scanning it, they're looking for keywords, they're looking for alignment with the role. And having a very artfully designed resume is pretty to look at, but it can actually hide some of the information that they're going to be looking for. So you want to minimize the colors that you use, any columns or fonts, to just those that are going to increase the legibility, that are going to help people find what you want them to find based on the job description and based on what are your strengths. In fact, we tend to say 2 is a good rule. No more than 2 different colors for font. Maybe 1 column, but I actually tend to shy away from columns at all. Only 2 different kinds of font and only 2 different kinds of formatting. For example, you can have the regular font and you can have a bolded font, or you can have the regular font and an underlined font, but you can't have regular, bolded, and underlined. That will start to make it a little bit harder to read and a little bit harder for them to grasp what you're actually wanting them to pay attention to. I actually have some examples to share. This is just an example of a template resume I pulled from online. And this is a resume that was actually used by one of our candidates who got called back for every role that they applied to. So we do have some evidence that this resume does pass those screens and does lead to interest in hiring managers. Now you look at this one and you might think that's a lot of text, but if you look at everything from the columns, it's actually a similar amount, and you can actually get more scanning this one from a hiring manager standpoint, because I can very easily see the different lab techniques this person's familiar with. I can really clearly find the experience section and get the details of what this person has done, what skills they've utilized, what particular field of research they were working in, even down to the type of cell type that they were using. And it still fits on one page. Versus this one, the detail is actually fairly sparse for how much it has on it. It's actually a little, the professional skills, I have to find them down here. They're not necessarily separated in a way that's easily scanned. And the room for the summary statement and for the details of the work experience is pretty minimal. I actually don't have a good sense of the skills this person has and how they've utilized them and the outcomes and their success metrics. Also important to note here is if you're applying to states-based roles, you want to leave a picture off for standard formatting. And one more thing to note before we move on that's not necessarily related to formatting, but does relate to your resume as a whole, is you want to do a proofread before you submit a resume. Because here you might notice there's an M that's been left off of maintained. And that's a really small mistake, like everyone makes it. But if they're looking for someone, for example, who is highly organized, that kind of a typo could count against you in applying. So do a proofread or have someone do a proofread with you of your resume before you submit it, just to make sure that those small formatting or spelling errors are not included. Now that we've kind of gone through some of the major differences between an industry resume formatting and an academic CV, and some ideas of what to do once you have one to get feedback, we're now going to go section by section with our tips on how to make each section really stand out for STEM roles. We're going to start with the header, a summary or objective statement, the experience section, education section, publications, and technical skills. Oh, this is a good way to lay it out. It doesn't necessarily need to be specifically in this order. The general rule of thumb is if you go to 2 pages, you want the most important information on the first page. So you want the summary and you want the experience on the first page. The order for the others can be a little more flexible. It's more about the content that's important. And for the header, the number 1 rule of thumb, the most important thing is accurate contact information. You might be saying that's a little obvious. Of course, I would have an email that I could be reached at that's spelled correctly. Of course, I would have the right phone number. But you also want to minimize confusion. So when we say accurate contact info, you want contact info where you can be reached quickly and where you're able to quickly respond for a request for a phone screen or an interview. And because of this, our tip is just use 1 professional email address and 1 phone number and make them the ones that you are going to check most frequently. And to also say it's okay to use a .edu if you are a recent graduate. If you've been out of school for a few years and you still have a .edu that you have access to, I wouldn't recommend using that one just because it can make you look a little more early career than you are. And also for the physical address, no one's going to send a request for an interview by mail anymore. And it can actually count against you in some ways if the physical address indicates that you will need relocation assistance. And because of that, we say only include the physical address if you live within commuting distance of the job. We know from surveys of our own users that the majority of scientists would be open to relocating for the right role. And that's something that you should be able to do. So leave it off and get to the phone screen. They'll ask about it then, but by then you'll also have introduced yourself. You'll have been able to talk about how your skills and experience align well with the role, your passion for the role, and that will make them more inclined to not only offer you the role, but potentially also offer relocation assistance to make that transition easier. Now, I know one of the questions from the chat was about how to stand out if you don't have a lot of work experience. And the education section is really where to focus on for this, to really, as we would say, make your degree count. Our tip is to include information like your thesis title and any relevant coursework if you don't have a detailed work history. If you have a detailed work history that does cover those same skills and fields of experience that the role is looking for, then you don't need to include as much information. But let me show you with an example what I'm talking about. So example, if you have a lot of work experience, say you're applying to a tissue engineering role, you can just have the degree, what it's in, and the university. But say you don't have work experience and the role is for tissue engineering, but they're also looking for something like computer-aided design, microfluidics, maybe some basic experience with some electrical engineering, and you have coursework that aligns with that, that will match those same keywords someone might be looking for, or you have a thesis title that's going to have some of those same keywords. Include those in the education section so that you're still able to include the jargon that the role is looking for. And as you might have guessed from that, in that I gave different advice for someone with a lot of work experience versus someone who's just looking for, say, their first role. One size does not fit all for the whole resume, but where this is probably the most apparent is the summary statement. The summary statement is a little bit like a mini cover letter. It's usually just 3 or 4 bullet points or 3 or 4 sentences, not very long at all. That's your chance to introduce them to your resume. You've already tailored your resume to show them why you care about this role and why you're a good fit for this role. But the summary section is really good opportunity for you to catch someone who is just skimming your resume and tell them exactly what you want them to know about you and exactly what they should be paying attention to and looking for in your resume. The two big things you want to answer are, why do you want the role and what will you contribute to the role? And the way you answer this is the why do you want it, telling them what about the role is exciting for you. That gets to the passion component. Then what will you contribute? What major skills are they looking for that you have that you'll be able to start utilizing day one? We have an example of a summary statement. Again, yours will be different because one size doesn't fit all, but there are some points here to mention. So it starts, I'm a research scientist with 5 years of experience with molecular and cellular biology techniques, including some metrics or numbers to give them an idea of how strong you are in the field or the techniques you've utilized is good. It helps you stand out. And then we get even more specific. We get to the what can you contribute day one. I've utilized primary cell culture and digital droplet PCR to investigate hypoxia-related changes. And these would be key skills that they're looking for in the role, or the particular therapeutic arena that the role is working within, say, combating hypoxic injury. And then we close with the why are you interested in the role? And it doesn't need to be to the extent of a cover letter where you're talking about what about the role is inspiring to you and what in your history has led you to be so passionate about this particular therapy or this particular product that the company's working on. Instead, this can just be a chance to show them that you've read the job description, that you understand what the company is doing, and that you're excited about it. A lot of companies get people applying for roles and they'll say, I didn't even know if from their resume, I didn't even know if they knew what we wanted or what we were doing. It's a project management role. And I get resumes from people saying that their passion is to be a research scientist. So even just closing with something as basic as stating that you're passionate about what the company's working on. For example, I'm interested in applying my skills and experience to the development of cellular models to investigate therapeutics for ischemic stroke. And here this would be taken directly from the company website. What are they working on? They're developing cellular models to investigate therapeutics for ischemic stroke. It shows them that you've at least researched the company to the extent that you know what they are working on and you're interested. They're looking for that mutual interest. And then on to the experience section. For a lot of people, this is probably going to be, if not one of, maybe the longest part of their resume. And it's a lot of information that could potentially be included. For anyone who's done a PhD who's on the call, if I asked you, write down everything that you did in your PhD. Okay, I mean, it's called a dissertation and it's very, very, very long. So instead, you want to focus on just including a few bullet points of the qualifications that overlap most significantly with what the role is looking for. And the reason I say connect the dots is I like bullet points for this. You don't necessarily need to use bullet points. You can just have sentences that you hit enter after. The real thing is you don't want to have paragraphs explaining what you've done. You want to make it very skimmable and you want to make it very clear when you're moving from one aspect of your experience to discussing the next aspect. And as you're setting up those bullet points or those sentences, action words speak louder than almost anything else in industry. Being able to articulate exactly what you did in a role and what you contributed to a project. It makes you look very assured as an applicant that you know your strengths, that you know your value, you know what you bring to the table. And it also makes it very clear to them what you have hands-on experience in and what you have more theoretical experience in. Don't summarize your experience as the hypotheses you were testing or the project aims. Instead, you want to focus on claiming the individual contributions and describe what you did specifically with the skills you utilized and what the outcomes were. So example, did you troubleshoot an assay, or did you develop a new protocol that the lab still utilizes? And the outcomes, they can be big things. They can be that it resulted in a publication. It could be small things too. It could be, for example, the SOP that the lab is continuing to use, or that you were able to discard a hypothesis that was not confirmed and move into a new avenue for the lab. You want to be able to show some positive contributions for your actions, not only because it shows how you are able to effectively utilize the skills that you are describing, but also it creates a sort of mini narrative with each bullet point. And people are able to follow narratives a little bit better. When something's left open-ended, they're kind of constantly waiting for the period, the closing remark. And if you're able to start, here's what I did, here's what I utilized to do that, and here's what it resulted in, that's a nice, neat little one-sentence narrative that they can close and feel like they have a good understanding of what you contributed to the project and what you'll be able to contribute to their project. I think someone also mentioned soft skills and how do you show those transferable skills that you bring. And the main thing here is you do want to include any of the transferable skills that they're looking for in the job description in the experience section when you can. If they're looking for someone who is a collaborative thinker, you want to have that word collaborative in your experience section. If they're looking for someone who is a strong science communicator, able to translate those difficult subjects to a non-scientific audience or a scientific audience that's not in your same field, you want to include evidence of that. But you want to show, not tell, because anyone can list soft skills. Anyone can say, I'm a natural leader. Anyone can say, I'm a strong communicator. But what'll make you stand out is if you can prove it with an example or with metrics in your experience section, or even in your education section, if working on, say, a team project was part of your education. Include that detail if you don't have the work experience. For example, instead of saying something like, I'm a team player who values scientific collaboration, include a little more detail, like collaborated on a cross-university project to examine ubiquitin-related changes in aging that resulted in 2 publications and an invited seminar. There's details there that I know that that's a real experience that you're discussing, and there's positive outcomes that I can see the effectiveness of your collaboration. Or if you don't want to include outcomes, including some metrics. Instead of saying, I'm a strong scientific communicator, try, I designed and led 3 public seminars on recent university discoveries with an average audience of 200 attendees. Here, enough details that I know that this is a real experience and some metrics for me to judge the communication against. And again, these are very specific examples just to show some of the detail that you can include and still keep it in one bullet point. But these are not your experiences, but if you really go through and mine your experience of where you've utilized your transferable skills, you'll be able to pull out examples with a similar amount of details and a similar amount of success or metrics to include. We mentioned how to include different skills in the summary section, different specific skills in the experience section, both transferable skills and technical skills. But knowing which ones to include is important. And you want to really copycat the jargon. And this is because people who are reviewing your resume for that first initial scan might not have a great deal of scientific experience. It's a good chance that the hiring manager, or your direct report, if you were hired on, will have a good grasp of your science, because they're looking for someone on their team who has these skill sets, who has this experience, who has this passion for a similar aspect of therapy or scientific exploration that they do. But the person who's initially reviewing for that 15-second scan might be HR, might be talent acquisition, might be an external recruiter, and they are not necessarily going to always understand your specific science. So you want to use the exact language for the skills from the job description. For an example, maybe you are applying to a role that says we need someone with gene editing experience, and your resume has CRISPR listed on it. And we'd think like, well, yeah, that's kind of a child term, or that falls under the umbrella, so they should be able to understand that I have that experience. But if they're asking specifically in the job description for gene editing, you want to include that umbrella term in there and make sure that shows up on your resume. For contrast, if they have, we need Western blot experience, and you have listed on your resume, I have experience with a broad range of biochemical assays. You'll hear it's the umbrella term or the parent term, which should be understood that probably have Western blot, or that's probably something that you want to follow up on and say, does that include Western blots, rather than just discarding the resume. But you can't always count on someone to make that connection. So whether they're using a broader term or they're using a very specific term, you want to ensure that the one that you're using matches what they're looking for in the job description. I know the presentation so far has been a lot of skills, but we also recommend including a separate skills section on your resume as well. And though this may seem redundant, this is because in STEM, skills are the #1 qualification for the majority of hiring managers. It's the main thing that will help them decide whether to call you for an interview. It'll be the main thing that they use to decide who to make an offer for all along the application pipeline. And you want to make sure that everything that you're including is what they're looking for in the job description. For example, on your general template resume that you work off of, it's probably okay just to have cell culture, primary cell culture listed. But if you're applying to a role that's specifically looking for, say, neuronal cell culture, you want to go back and before you submit the resume in your skills section, make sure that that specific cell type experience is listed. You don't need to go into that specific detail for every role that you're applying for, but you want to make sure it's at least in the skills section prominently for roles that are looking for something that specific. And for organization, I know on the template resume that we showed, they had a table. And I've heard from people there's concerns about using a table because some of the older applicant tracking systems might get thrown off by them the same way they can get thrown off by columns. So a good way to still include a skills section that's well organized, that doesn't include that concern, is to use this kind of formatted paragraph work where you're dividing the skills still by the major field that they fall under, and using some of this formatting that actually does enhance legibility. Here, bolding, non-bolding does actually make the resume a lot more readable. This is a good example for when to use those kind of extra formatting options. And then going into some degree of detail for them. And you could even move these around for different roles. So say you have something like this and you're applying to a role that is putting a lot more emphasis on the software side, then you can just cut and paste that hire on your skills section. It's a way that you can tailor a resume for each role where you're applying to without taking a long time to do that tailoring. For a lot of academic CVs, you're going to be including a lot of your publications and awards because you're giving them a whole view of what you've done in your career. Because you're really trying to include just the most relevant for industry resumes, we mentioned 2 R's, relevant and recent. Publications are utilized as evidence in industry. They're going to look at potentially the methods section to see if there's proof that you have utilized the skills that they are looking for you to have, or if you've published in a particular area of research that aligns with their area of research. But they're not a primary screening factor like skills are, they're secondary. And so to save space and also make it easier for them to see that you align well with the role, include just about 3 to 5 publications in a abbreviated publication section with a list to your full publications, with a link to your full publications, in case that someone does want to go through your full publication history. But because that's not the norm, limit it to ones where you are, say, first author, that it's been recent, and most importantly, that it has some skills or field alignment with the role. I know when we go through resumes and cover letters, a big question is, what about cover letters? Resume's nice, gone through tailoring a resume. How do I write a cover letter? And honestly, about 80% of employers say they don't read cover letters. Only about 20% of them read cover letters. To those 20%, cover letters might matter quite a bit, but just looking at the law of averages, it's really more worthwhile to take time to tailor your resume and really use the summary or objective section as a mini cover letter than to spend a lot of time writing a long cover letter for each role. Only include a cover letter if it's specifically requested. And I said, instead use summary statement as a mini cover letter. If you look at your cover letters or how you usually write cover letters as you're going to make an outline of that cover letter, what would be like the 3 bullet points for your cover letter? Those are what are your bullet points in your summary statement. And if you need to write a cover letter for a role, you can go take it the other way. Just take the bullet points you have for the summary statement, put it into another document, and expand on it in the cover letter, include a little more details. But it's not something that's as valuable as making sure that they see the resume as aligned and specific for the role.